For what you see arranged here are the contents of Eleanor Roosevelt's wallet at the time of her death.
McShane offered to build the gatehouse for the sum of $1. The president gladly accepted.
Half of the Japanese Americans who were put into camp on this suspicion were kids.
And this particular woman loved being a machinist. And when the war was over, she had to give that job up.
18 countries took part in the first Commission on Human Rights.
Everyone has the right to seek asylum from persecution.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful fall evening, right? I don't know about you, but waking up tomorrow is going to be leaves, leaves, leaves. So that's why I don't like rain and wind. Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace Center. We have a wonderful program for you tonight. My name's Jeff Urbin. I'm the education director here, and we are in for an incredible treat. We have some fantastically talented women here who have made a fantastically wonderful film. And we had a group of 8th graders in this afternoon, and they really took to the film, and it was a great opportunity to introduce them to a medium that could also speak to history. Speaking of history, as you probably all know, World War II began on September 1st, 1939. And not a lot of Americans realize that, right? Most people think it began on December 7th, 1941, right? Well, that's when it began for us. And the events that led up to the attack at Pearl Harbor were really prefaced by almost 3 years of Franklin Roosevelt keeping a careful eye on what was going on in Europe and the Pacific, hoping against hope that we would not be dragged into the Second World War. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. He had seen up close, the horrors of a world war. And he saw the signs and symptoms of another world war on the horizon. He was walking this fine line with the United States between preparing us for the war, if it were to come, but at the same time hoping against hope that we wouldn't be dragged into it. And of course, that all came to an end on December 7th, 1941. And shortly after that attack, President Roosevelt gave a radio address, and he said, "We are now in this war. We are all in it all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history. We must share together the bad news and the good news, the defeats and the victories, the changing fortunes of war." And the film that you are about to see, it focuses in on one particular group of those men, women, and children. It is the women who went to work to produce the goods, produce the supplies, to produce the weapons that were necessary to defeat Nazi Germany and its allies during the Second World War. What's interesting to note is that from December 7th, 1941, to about 18 months later, the United States, 18 months after that attack, was producing about 80% of the material being used by the Allies. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, we were ranked something like anywhere from 14th to 17th in military power behind Portugal. So we really came to our feet, we really got the job done, and the women that you're going to see in this film played a big, big role in that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the girl with the rivet gun.
This is Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt's regular Sunday evening broadcast at 6:45 Eastern Wartime.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the present time, it is of paramount importance that the women and girls of our country be given training so that they may do their share in the war emergency. Hundreds of girls are gaining experience and training in sheet metal work. Such training is essential for many jobs in aircraft and other war industries.
This picture was taken outside of Gus X Machine Products in Long Island City. And I'm dressed in my work clothes. The first department I was sent into, I stood at a kick press. There were machines here. You felt like you could do something. The drill presses and the lathes and the screw machines and the milling machine all had big belts with the pulley on the ceiling, flapping. Noise. My then husband went into the service 6 months after Pearl Harbor. And many of the young women were in the same position. I was living with my sister at the time. I'd come home from work and she said, "Number one, you stink. Get out of here, go take a shower." You work in a spray of turpentine or something. You cleaned yourself with motor oil at the end of the day. But you felt you were doing it for the war, you know?
Down to Brooklyn Navy Yard. Use all the hands we can get. There's a war going on down that apron and pick up a rivet gun.
I was seeking employment because I really wanted to be a nurse or a teacher. I'd seen enough young mothers with a house full of babies. So 2 other girls and I went to what we called the Defense Training School. And that landed us in the old Chevrolet plant, riveting. That's how Rosie the Riveter came into my life. At that time, it wasn't important except that we were riveters and we were doing something and making more money than anybody in our family.
I worked at Woodall Industry in Detroit. I made the Curtiss Wright Helldiver, which was a dive bomber that traveled on ships and then bombed from the ships. Pilots didn't really like to fly them, but when they went out, they knew they were coming back because they were serviceable. They'd get shot up every which way and then almost always get back to the ship with them. But when they got back to the ship, and here's my tearjerker, they'd push them off in the ocean. Because I couldn't stand it when they'd say they'd push my Helldiver off in the ocean, but they weren't fit to fly again. But it really did hurt to think my Helldiver was going in the ocean.
Over here on my right, we have Mare, who is the director of the film that you just saw. We have Danielle Ash, who is the artist and creator of the puppets that we just enjoyed. We have our good friend Kirsten Kelly, who is the director and producer as well. And we have Elizabeth Hemmerdinger, who was the producer, which allowed the whole thing to take place. We also have Ryan Bloom, who is one of the assistants in the production, and also Laverne Barry, who was the executive producer there as well. Okay, so I want to start simply by saying congratulations on making a fantastic film. We're big fans of it around here, and it's an opportunity, wonderful opportunity for us to share it with folks out here. So somebody tell me, how did the idea for this project come about?
Do you want to take this one, Elizabeth?
It's my fault. I had an idea to do a play about a girl who becomes Rosie the Riveter. And I realized I didn't know enough about Rosies, real Rosies. I'm just on the cusp of people who remember that they were the workforce. So I called my 2 buddies who I'd worked with before and said, let's let's see what we can, how we can do the research, and then I'll let one of you take over.
What was really interesting when we first started talking to people about Rosie the Riveter is how many people said, oh, my aunt was a Rosie, or my grandma was a Rosie, or my next door neighbor was a Rosie. And we realized that many of these women were still alive, but they were in their 80s and 90s at the time. And Elizabeth, who is a genius at making things happen, arranged for us to do a series of videotaped oral histories of women for NYU libraries in New York City. And so for about a year and a half, we traveled around the country and we met 48 different women who were Rosie the Riveters, and we interviewed them about their life stories. And we talked to them about their childhoods and how they grew up, and we kept being blown away by the fact that we were hearing all these stories that we had never really heard, and that our idea of Rosie from sort of the Westinghouse We Can Do It poster or the Norman Rockwell Saturday Evening Post cover was really a very small percentage of what we were hearing, but that we were actually hearing stories all across America from all kinds of Americans about what that meant. And so, we always knew we wanted to do something with those interviews. And someone came up with the crazy idea that we should maybe do animation to bring some of their stories to life, because all we had were these sort of talking heads of older women telling their stories. And then you want to tell the story of the animation workshop we did and how that came about?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was, we always wanted to do something artistic with these stories, kind of these golden moment stories that really stuck with us. So we invited 4 female animators, and animation also being a challenging industry for women historically to break into. So we really wanted to support women artists, women, on this project in the spirit of Rosie. And so we came together at the Eleanor Roosevelt house at Hunter, right? And then spent a couple days exploring the stories, exploring different styles. And then, we ended up working with Danielle. And really, we started with one story, and then we kind of blended into additional stories so that it really became the film that you see today. So, and the 48 interviews, anybody can see them. They are part of the Tamanent Labor Library online resources, so they're public access, they're free. You can
if you search for the Real Rosie the Riveter project online, you can find them all.
How did you find these Rosies?
Well, all different ways, actually. Kirsten knew Esther, who's the first woman who speaks in the film, was actually in an intergenerational theater group that Kirsten was directing at the time. And so that was how we found Esther. We found women a number of ways. We did find a lot of the women. There is a annual Rosie the Riveter reunion or conference that happened. It still happens now, although there's fewer and fewer women. So we actually traveled to Nashville, which is where it was that year, and we met a number of women there, including Millie, who's the last woman that you meet in the film. So
here's what we didn't find, though. Any kind of public record or private record about these women. There were around 6 million who were not documented because the government and the companies and the unions didn't want the jobs to become permanent. So they were unknown. So in fact, we were in a race to find whoever was still available for an interview and capable of continuing to talk. There were a lot of them that were older than these 48 that we have.
So Elizabeth, what you're saying is that there was a concerted effort by the government and the unions not to document these women. And what was the purpose of that?
Well, if I had a job that was 75 cents an hour, my name would be there, and I'd be able to get another job like that. So a word that's newer, we were ghosted. We women were ghosted and wiped, there was no record of us. When the war ended on the West Coast, a bell rang, and the voice over the intercom said, everybody put your tools down and go home, to all the women. And then a few months later, 6 weeks later, it happened on the East Coast. Whistle blew, leave your things, take your lunchbox with you, you're done. And within a month or two, the men started to come home, and their jobs were waiting for them. The companies had to retool, but they were there. So we did what we could to save the stories of the ones we could gather.
How did the Rosies feel about that? Did they know at the time they were being
they're furious.
Well, and it was interesting because
so, yeah.
I think they expressed to us anyway a variety of feelings about it. A couple of the women remained doing that kind of work. Millie being one of them, she kept working. She worked during the Korean War. She was very devoted to that as a profession, and she talks about that. But most women, you know, the funny thing is it was this window where women had always worked, but it was this window where they actually were earning somewhat on a par with men for the first time, or earning enough to support themselves for the first time. And so it was this level of independence that was then, it was open and then it was closed. So it was a really unique thing in history.
Right, because up to that time, we had to explain this to the students this afternoon, up to that time, the career choice for women generally was school teacher, secretary, or nurse.
Yeah, or homemaker, or domestic, domestic help.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So they had the sense that they were going to be just dispelled and
No, they didn't know.
They didn't know that.
No, they put in a time card every week, and their name was on that card, and they had identities, but there was no record kept of them.
Yeah.
6 million, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So you say you worked with these guys before, some of these folks? So how
Anne
did,
and
how
I
did this
have-
team come together? And how long did it take to gel?
I talked enough. Your turn.
Oh,
You can
well,
talk about it.
Elizabeth and I have known each other since the days before time, almost. We first started working together in theater when I was a wee child of 21 or something. And we'd worked together on a number of theater projects. And Kirsten and I met about 24 or 5 years ago and started making movies about a few years after that. Danielle is the newcomer. We've only known her for about a decade, so, you know.
And I wanted to be a producer on the film that they were making, and they wouldn't let me.
What?
You wouldn't let me on the home stretch.
Breaking news, ladies and gentlemen.
No.
Well, do tell.
Well, they were, so I was not that young person who Anne knew. I was considerably older, and they were going into very rough neighborhoods, making a wonderful film. And I was watching drafts of the film and giving some comments and stuff. And then it's very hard to raise money for films like this. Public television, it won't take you if you self-fund the film. So you're in a downward spiral that makes you kind of crazy. And so eventually you put up a GoFundMe thing. And so I said, well, can I do it that way? Will you let me in? And they went, well, okay.
I mean, these are projects that take a long time and that are definitely projects of love. It's not a business to make documentary films. And so, you know, you do the best you can. We obviously fell in love with these particular stories. And Elizabeth really made it happen for us that we were able to finish the film. So.
And we won an Emmy.
Yeah.
Which was, so that was.
For another, not for this
They
film,
won
for
it.
another
They really won it because I wasn't even a part of it. But,
Let's
Onward.
bring Danielle in
yes,
on this. So,
please.
So these crazy women show up and they say, hey, we're going to tell the story of Rosie the River like it's never been told before. We want to do it in animation. How did that set with you? And did you say, oh, I've got just the cardboard for that?
I do. I have been making cardboard films for quite some time before I made this one, for Sesame Street and Jack Daniels commercials and other types of things. But I was really inspired by the workshop that we had all together when we actually invited the Rosies there too. And I got to meet them and hear their stories in person. And it kept me going for the 5+ years that we've worked on this project, animating it. It definitely held my interest and kept me going.
We really fell in love with Danielle's cardboard filmmaking because we felt like it was so powerful of a medium to explore the factories and all the moving parts and all the machinery. It was so tactile, it was so maker-oriented, and
it was very fun to build the whole thing. I loved making the kick presses and all of the cranks and gears that turned, and I felt like cardboard was sort of a perfect material for that, so much texture and liveliness.
Yeah.
And when you come back to the Dyson room to see these things up close, they're incredible. You know, you've seen them in action, and then when you see them, you know, they're cardboard. You know, they're just cardboard. I'm sorry, I don't mean just cardboard. But they're cardboard that you've breathed life into, and it's amazing how they're able to tell that story. So you interview 48 Rosie the Riveters, and tell us a little bit about what that process was like. Did you go in with questions, or did you just sit down and say, tell us what it was like to be a Rosie? What were you trying to extract from them?
We had a series of questions that we worked out with the historian at NYU Libraries at the Labor Archives, and we were really interested in the what Rosie did to change their experience in life, like where it sat in their whole life story. So we talked about their childhood and how they grew up. We talked about what the experience of being Rosie was, and we talked economically, we talked in terms of identity, and then we asked them about their lives afterwards. We heard amazing stories. I mean, I wish we could make 10 of these films because we have so many stories that were so powerful, you know, which we can tell some anecdotes later, but like the thing that inspired us to keep going and to take those interviews and turn them into a film was that it sort of felt like history was like slipping through our fingers as we were talking to them, that these were stories that no one had really heard, and that these women were getting older, they were passing away, and we really wanted to be able to honor what experience they had.
Well, and I think you know, for me, I grew up in the Midwest and from a farm community, and you know, I knew the poster and I knew what a Rosie the Riveter was, but not much beyond that. And I think, you know, always just really interested in these stories. And I found out my own grandmother was a Rosie.
Yeah, we interviewed her.
And they really, she was like, I didn't think it was that big of a deal. And it was really fun to like make it a big deal. Yeah. And you know, what you learn about that time and that special time of sitting down with someone who's lived that much life, and have it be vital again on both sides of that conversation. And you know, for her as a farm girl growing up on a peach farm, that was the first time she ever got her own paycheck. Was the first time. And you know what she did? She eventually, in the first like couple of months, she's like, I bought 27 bras.
She did.
She remembered this so specific because she had her own money. She's like, nobody could tell me what I could buy because I had my own money.
I think that's the first time 27 bras has ever been mentioned on this site. I'm happy to have been a part of it.
She's a lady who passed away miraculously with her original red hair at 93. So, you know.
But it was just this
and 26 bras left?
20, I don't know.
Of being able to do that, right? That freedom for the first time to be able to do that. So Herman Eberhard, our museum curator, is here, and he's always tasked with the job of telling the story of Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, Great Depression, all of that in 50,000 square feet. And I see him working on it. It's an incredibly hard job. How do you tell the story of Rosie the Riveters? You've interviewed 48 people. How do you determine and decide what goes into the story, what stays out of the story?
It's a process. I mean, we didn't sit down, write a script and make that film. I mean, you go through, you figure out what's the most powerful moment, what's the most complementary to that. We had certain themes that we knew we wanted to tease out with these three women. There were sort of threads of economics and threads of racial relations and threads of labor relations that we wanted to weave through, and all of the women's stories touched on those things in ways that we felt were really complementary. But there's so many stories we wish we could tell. I don't think we've told the story of Rosie the Riveter, but I hope that what we did was to show three women who were different enough, yet had enough of a shared experience that you can walk away with a curiosity about all the other women that you don't know, that you're not hearing their story.
Well, I think one thing that just inspired us all, I think, was the youth aspect of trying to bring the story in a way that, really enriched young people's learning experience about not just war, but about gender and, their grandparents and their great-grandparents. And, I have a young son, and it was really inspiring to me to take it to his third grade class, because they were learning about, different wars and, and, you hear the soldier side, and you hear a very often male side, which is, his grandfather was in the Air Force, and that's all wonderful, but it was exciting to kind of bring this and say there is a whole other perspective and layer to this kind of, our country and the war and everything. So it's had a really good youth connection.
That's what attracted me to it when I first saw it. As the educator, I immediately thought, my God, it's telling so many incredible stories that young people need to know. And I like the use of your word layer, because this film is so layered. It's layered with the story of the women. It's layered with the story of race. It's layered with the story of North and South, all of these things. And then actually in the production, it's layered as well. I mean, there's the puppets, there's the sound, there's the music. It really kind of all comes together. Was that something that you guys sat down at the beginning to do, or was it something that developed as you went through?
It definitely developed. We knew certain aspects of it, but it definitely developed. And it was so exciting when the sound came in. Our sound designer is a brilliant woman, also a woman named Andrea Bella, and she sort of specializes in these documentaries that are more, that need more sort of like help in terms of audio. And she created all of the sounds in the factories, and we had a great day in the recording studio doing all the background voices that you hear that you might not even have been aware of hearing. The sort of radio broadcast and the background conversation in a factory setting. So it was really fun.
It really hits a lot of the modalities with education,
Well, and Danielle's work itself is so layered because, not only is she making the puppets, but she's laying it up against archival photographs, and we had, reproductions of the posters, and, so there's just a lot going on. It's really fun. Mm-hmm. It's a really fun process. But no, we did not make every decision and then complete those decisions.
Yeah. We had a really pivotal moment where we were working on the animation and the script, and we originally were not going to put the original interview clips in of the women as older. We were just going to have their voices, and it just wasn't quite hitting the emotionality that we wanted. And we started playing with using the clips. I said, we think we have to use both of those things because that makes it human, and then you could start to see hearing from someone who has lived such a long life full of so many transitions, having them talk about an experience from that perspective is so meaningful because they've had so much time to really process and remember, and going through old photographs with people. It's very, it felt very special to be in that time with those women.
Yeah. These three women were very succinct also about how they told their stories. So there were other ones that we could go back. We thought about it and discarded the idea, but make a longer form or the same amount of time, but on one woman and young girl tell her story. But this seemed to capture enough of the history and the times that. That's what we came to.
Right, and it really does make it three-dimensional, not just the Rosie poster. Now, you said you interviewed these 48 women, and how long did each interview take?
It ranged in time. I think we spent 2 hours with one woman, which was the longest. And then a couple of the interviews were fairly short, maybe 20 minutes, because that was sort of the extent of time those women had in them to be on at that age. But most of the interviews are around 35 to 45 minutes long.
And I really listened to all of the interviews as I made the puppets. I was listening to everything they said as I tried to capture their essence in a puppet, which was a challenge because they're such amazing women. It was hard to find what I thought that they should look like in cardboard form.
Yeah, and that was really, to have them in cardboard form and then in real form, that's really showing the contrast. So that was a real, dangerous thing that you guys did, but you pulled it off,
Well,
beautifully.
it shows Danielle's capacity to create in a flat way what these wonderful women are doing. The one who cries, she gets so angry when, it's just two slashes, but it's brilliant artistry.
So you've got 48 women, you've got anything from 20 minutes to 2 hours. You must have incredible stories without betraying any trust or promises that you made to these women. Can you share with us some sort of backstory? I mean, the Rosie the Riveter that we're presented with is so one-dimensional. Your film brings that, to a new level with the three-dimension, but I'm sure there were other
so many stories.
Can we
Yeah.
hear some of those?
Atom bomb, that was...
Oh, yeah. So one of our favorite stories is a woman named Shirley Clark, who was born in Chicago and was good at math and got hired by the Chrysler Corporation as a human computer, as a number cruncher. And she would go to work every day in the Chrysler Corporation building. And she had no idea what she was doing. She was just processing figures. And the day after they dropped the atomic bomb, they called her whole department in and gave them a little pin, which she still had, which had a little A on it, and told them they were part of the computations for making the atomic bomb. And this was the moral dilemma of this woman's life for the rest of her life, that she was part of making this incredibly horrible, powerful weapon. And her story really echoed to me. She was such a gentle, gracious woman, and it really impacted me how everyday people are caught up in history. That, we're all living our little lives, we're all, we have our families, we have our own personal situation, but we actually are all part of this larger kind of human experiment. And her story really, really moved us. I don't know, you want to tell another one? You want to tell?
Sure. Well, we heard so many stories about, which I never really thought about or heard of, but so many about the children. So all these women went to work, majority men were gone to war. So what happened to the children, and what were the creative ideas that these women came up with to allow them to work? And, some of them locked them in their car during their shift and with food and water and, and games and toys, because that's what there was no daycare centers. Or they would band together, like 3 women and their children would all live together, but each take a different shift, so that there was always at least 1 or 2 moms to take care. It's like, when did you sleep? Well, we didn't sleep. So it's just interesting to hear about, how the layers that you kind of don't hear about in history.
And a lot of stories about economic independence, a lot of stories about what that meant to finally, as a woman, as a young woman, have your own, have your own resources. There was a ton of stories about that.
Some were uprooted, going clear across the country from a rural place in the Midwest or further west to Wilmington. There's that woman who traveled all the way to Wilmington and lived alone or lived in a boarding house. The story of the woman who got on the train, or the train or the bus, and she was wearing pants, and they made fun of her. The men made fun of her because she was wearing pants. So there's so many of them.
Yeah, a lot of stories.
There was a woman who saved her money and surprised her husband when he came back, right? That she was made enough to get a down payment for their first house, And when he came home, she had a house for them, and it was like really amazing.
So there was no effort on the part of the government to provide for childcare for these women. It was just we
Not-
need you to work, and
Not
figure
that-
out the rest of it.
Yeah, and great grandparents came in. We had the teacher. One of the teachers today said my great grandmother took care of her grandkids while her daughter went and worked.
It's incredible.
And you kind of made it work.
Yeah, I think it's, what you just said a moment ago, Ann, is so important, that, it's history, but history is this fabric of so many stories. And, that's, I think, what I like about the film is it brings out this thread of these women that went through here, and then interties that with, the race and, the equity and the economics and all the rest of that stuff. So how did you know when you had enough? How did you know when, okay, we're ready to put the scissors to the cardboard and get going, like with actually, because you can do analysis paralysis where you can keep interviewing, but how did you know when you had yours?
We were really lucky because the interviews were done as part of this project for NYU. So we did all of the interviews in 2010 and 2011. And then once those interviews were done, we really struggled with what do we do with this amazing material and how do we bring it to life? It's going to be at the library forever and preserved there, but we really wanted to do something to honor the women. And so we didn't have quite that problem because we had the other problem, which is we just had all of these stories to choose from. And we went through and we marked our favorite stories. We looked at them next to each other with what would work with what. And then also thinking about what Danielle could animate and what would look good in animation. Knowing that we wanted like a big factory scene and the little factory scenes, knowing that and then Danielle brought some things to the table that we had not even really thought of, like that marvelous scene where Esther comes home to her sister's house and her sister tells her she stinks, the details and the humor of those moments and the pigeons that fly through and it is I always think the thing about creative processes is that it isn't linear. You have to explore and you have to follow your curiosity. And it was really fun to do that with this group of women.
Yeah.
It was a really fun process.
So that's great, and it sounds very kumbaya.
No.
But there had to have been some moments where you said to each other.
No, we didn't. I don't think we ever had a cross word with each other, but thanks to Laverne, who's sitting there, we ended up getting a contract with the NYU libraries, which was like dealing with a Tarant, the biggest dinosaur you could ever imagine with wings and claws. And
I worked for the government. I couldn't imagine that.
And so that was a lot of attenuated work. And then we had to that was my job, find the money to for the legal work, for the negotiating with some of the women. We hired. This is a terrible story. This is really the worst story. We hired several young women from NYU, from theater schools and stuff, and we hired a historian, an oral historian. You're looking at me like I'm crazy. I shouldn't tell this story. She sued us, me, for because we didn't pay her. But we never met. The agreement said we're not paying you. But you got money. Well, we got money so we could do the editing and travel and so that took a while. Some things limited us that we hadn't even imagined could have happened.
There's a point of conflict between the humanitarian reasons or the artistic reasons or the personal reasons why you want to tell a story and trying to make a film in the world. And you just sort of have to navigate that. It's the least interesting part of what we do in a lot of ways, but it is a part of it.
Well, and I think it takes so long. Well, animation takes so long anyways, but we're all working other jobs.
Yeah.
This was our passion project, and we did. We were supported, and but it's not a full time. You're all working every job you can, and Danielle too, to keep it going. So we would be like, we can work on it this week. we can't this week because we're all on other jobs, or, you know, you just kind of keep the main piece of advice you get as a documentary filmmaker is finish it. No matter how long it takes.
Was there a point where you guys hit a particular low spot where you said, you know what?
What are you digging at this
Yeah.
for, Jeff? Why are you digging? I think you actually heard one of our low points.
There's no scandal.
So we
No,
don't know
we
Rosie's
really,
scandal.
we honestly, we had a wonderful time. And every time we've worked together, we really have had a wonderful time.
So then the
Not-
most
never a question.
contentious point was when the guy in the middle kept asking you if there was any contentious
Yes.
point.
Yeah, right.
I get it.
Yes, we're like, who is this guy?
No, and I know you guys work great together, and the product speaks for itself. But it's just, you know, it's just such a creative process. I mean, it's just there's so many decisions that have to be made, and things that you don't think about, you know, lawsuits and this and that, and all the rest of that stuff. So before we go to questions from the audience, I want to ask each of you if you could share with us like one Eureka moment that you had in the making of this. That, like, wow, you know, I learned that, I found that out, or I discovered that maybe you didn't think about going into it. And I'll let whoever wants to start.
I'll jump in because I think I realized just how key this movement, this what I call the Rosie movement of so many women being called to work, how that affected the next generation. Because I always thought of it as something very separate, but then I see, okay, yes, most of the women, you know, were told to go home and be back in the home, but damn if they didn't make sure their daughters weren't educated and went to college, and those women, you know, fought for rights in a way that they might not have without that. So it sort of, and then their grandchildren and on, and I think it, you know, it really did. It was this moment where something so dramatically shifted for women as a collective. This door opened, and you know, it really affected so many things in later generations.
I got deeper into, and I don't know that much, but I'm sure there are scholars who would correct me, but the work that Eleanor Roosevelt did to talk not just her husband, but the titans of industry into making room for these women, giving them a chance. The big Kaiser and all those big shots said, goodbye. The women, how are they going to build a ship? Well, they built the Liberty ships. They were being made, if I remember correctly, one every 5 days or 18 hours or some ridiculous, ridiculously low amount of time, but they did it. And that really was Eleanor Roosevelt. So I'm so pleased to be here.
Yeah, Mrs. Roosevelt often had her ways of having things go behind the scenes.
I think for me, the most intriguing part was really doing all the research that we did and really looking into the archives that we had available to see all the actual photographic images that then inspired what I created. The factory scenes, the airplanes. I actually looked at blueprints and things like that before building what I built, and I learned a lot, and it was definitely a great experience to make something that was so meaningful as a female animator. It has been a hard thing to break into such a male-dominated industry, so I really connected to this theme also.
I think mine is a little less historic, and it's more the thing I said earlier about history is people's stories, but then on a really personal level, like Danielle described the pace of this work as glacial because, you know, it takes so long to create, and that idea that you can spend that much time on something has very much impacted my filmmaking practice. Like, I think we live in a world where things move so quickly and we're on deadline all the time, and we've got to, it's given me a lot of freedom in the way I think about my own work, that it doesn't have to be on the clock in a weird way. I don't know what I'm going to do with that, but but that's something that I definitely feel right now. So.
All right, so we'll open it up to questions from folks out there. Cliff Lauby, our public affairs guy, will come around with the microphone.
Danielle, just curious, did any work wind up on the cutting room floor where you decided, I'm just not going to do it? Or did you have the 3 already picked before you started working on the animation?
Well, since it was such a project that was in development and we all working on it together, there were a lot of ideas that we had that we sort of canned. But we also discovered halfway through the production that one of the Rosies, Millie, did not look like what we thought she looked like. And she had dark brown hair instead of blonde hair. And so I completely remade that puppet. And even redid some of the animated sequences. So that was a bit hard to have some of the animation just cut out because of factual error on our part. But I think we really made the most of it and tried to use as much of the animation as we could so that not too much time was wasted.
No, there wasn't a lot that ended up on of actual animated footage, there wasn't a lot that ended up not being used. We used almost every frame of it because it's so labor intensive to do. What Danielle was talking about the sequence where she's putting on her pants, that marvelous sequence, that sequence had been done before with the other puppet, and that was the saddest thing. Was that
They're like, oh, her hair color.
That was a big deal.
It always comes out better the second time.
Yeah.
But Danielle's studio is so magical that we would be working there and we would be finding little things from other projects, like the pigeons. We're like, oh, you can use these pigeons. You have these over here, and let's use them.
Yeah. I even had a cardboard roller coaster, but that didn't.
Maybe in the sequel.
Yes.
Did I see another question out there? Yeah.
Kirsten, you mentioned, I think you were interviewing your grandmother, and she said, I didn't really think it was that big of a deal. And Anne, you said, I think you made a point about how we don't realize we're all part of bigger things. Those are 2 similar comments. Did you find that a common theme in these interviews, that most or many of the women didn't really think of this as a big deal? Yeah. And was your interviewing of them, did that change their perception of their past experience?
I think definitely. We had women, we definitely had, the women were all very proud of what they'd done for the most part, whether it was being proud of the economics of what they were able to accomplish or being proud of being part of the war effort. We had a couple of women who were actually sort of anti-war, who talked about anti-war in general, not anti that particular war. But so we had a lot of different perspectives on it. But most of the women, I don't think, I think that us paying attention to their stories and asking them about their stories definitely made an impact on them. They mentioned that to us. Almost all of the women talked about that with us,
Well, and I think too, like speaking for, my grandmother, I think there was also this, weight of that poster on that generation too. And so what lived on from that experience was the We Can Do It poster, which became iconic for, multiple generations and was wonderful, but also to her and to them, it's like, she worked on Jeep motors. So she didn't actually carry a riveter. She had another kind of tool and thing. And so we really wanted to expand that exact definition so it wasn't just one lane of a Rosie and what is a Rosie. And I think that kind of brought into the process in the interview for many people. It was like, oh yeah, all of those other things, I was that, and we had to wear pants and we experienced all these other things. And so I think that was also part of that realization of like expanding just that movement and the idea that it was a movement.
Yeah. Susan King in the very end says that thing about we didn't know at the time. It was like the woman who just went into outer space. It was like we were doing something so crazy. We didn't really understand what we were doing until after we did it. And I think that was a really universal feeling. Yeah.
Were they surprised that you were coming back all these years later and taking an interest in them?
Some of them.
Yeah.
Some of them were very anxious to tell their story. Some of them were sort of, why do you want to talk to me? Like, we had a very broad range of responses, as you would imagine.
I mean, several of them say that they were the poster girl.
Yeah.
So probably, and there's,
Yeah.
7 or 8 women who claim this, that they're that poster girl. So they're like, yeah, that was me. It's like, okay.
Herman, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't we, not us, but didn't we actually, somebody identify who the actual real live?
Yeah.
We had an exhibit of World War II posters a few years ago, and we were very interested in that poster. And it turns out there was a professor at Seton Hall who did all this research. Actually, his story made the front page of the New York Times when he finally tracked the woman down who actually was the inspiration for the poster. And she worked at a naval base somewhere on the West Coast. I've forgotten the details, but you can look it up on the New York Times.
And that's 100% confirmed.
Yes,
Okay,
it is.
I got to call my grandmother. Hold on.
Wait, we had lunch with
We had
another
lunch-
one.
another
who,
one, yeah.
Who believed that,
That she was the inspiration.
She was a debutante and got thrown out of the house. And she believes that Charlie Knickerbocker, who was a gossip columnist, was identifying her. I don't want to tell you her name, but
Since I have the mic,
famous
I have a
name.
question actually I wanted to ask. So with the interviews that you did for the project, did any of these women in the interviews reveal anything about were any of them involved in the post-war women's rights movement? Did they find their experience in somehow spark that?
No, we did, interestingly enough, have one woman who was a lesbian who became very involved in that movement. She had a fascinating story and actually drove from the East Coast to the West Coast in a Model T Ford to work out in the shipyards in California. And she became one of the founders of an organization in New York called SAGE, which was Senior Action in the Gay Environment. And she was a big advocate for particularly older gay activism. But I don't remember anyone who was a real... There were a couple who did not... Esther, yeah.
Esther really became part of the movement.
But there
yeah.
were a couple we interviewed in Baltimore that were like, we're not those women's libbers.
Yes, that's right.
So you had a really big range of experience around that.
it was their daughters
Yeah.
and sons, their children, who understood the power of what they had done.
Yeah, yeah.
Any other questions? No. There you go.
So firstly, I had a comment. I think that had you only started this project now instead of 10, 12 years ago, I think you mentioned the interviews were done in 10 or 11, right? It would be almost impossible, because if I try to wrap the timeline around my head, the youngest of these women must be now 98 or 99, because assuming that they start working at 18, they would have had to have been born in 1923. So I'm sure the vast majority of the women you interviewed are no longer around. That's number one. Number two, my question is, when you're interviewing 48 women, that's, I'm guessing, roughly 48 hours worth of interviews, give or take. How do you sort of compress all of their information into such a short film and pick and choose what you want to include and not? That must have been a real challenge.
Yeah,
Yes.
It was.
Well, and not only, it's also what 3 could fit together. Is it 3? Is it 4? Is it 2? We had to do a little bit experimenting with that. But I think we each had golden stories that really stuck with us, that's kind of what we brought to the table first and put it in a hat and started to really just live with these stories and figure out the themes. It's like, okay, there's some themes that we can't do it all. So how do we get the themes we want and put them in this? Yeah. We'd love to do 3 more films. We have the material for it, but we got this one done and over the finish line. So, but that's a great question. But some of the longer interviews and you can get transcripts of them as well, but we wanted them available for knowing that, these amazing sources were not going to be with us that much longer. Yeah. And that there was some video, there was a lot of audio oral histories, but not many videos. So we wanted that to be free access for anybody to do research with. So they're really interesting to just, yeah, like, you know, better than a podcast. So just pop it in and take a run. Yeah.
They're beautifully shot too, so you can go and look for the real Rosie the Riveter project and meet the women. Maybe someday we'll make more, but I don't know. Everybody's clock is ticking, and we have things to do.
Miss Danielle, did you you had mentioned that the animation career was a male-dominated career. Did you yourself have any problems with you being a female animator in this career?
I did. You know, when I was young and trying to break into the industry, all of my coworkers were guys, and it definitely felt like a club. So I kind of had to force my way into it. But I felt that animation was always just something I was so passionate about and really into that I felt like I kind of fit myself into that world of guys anyway. And the industry has changed, though, in the 20-some years that I've been in it. And it definitely, there's more women directors out there, more women animators, and more women in graphics than ever before. So that's been encouraging to see that change even during my time. So when I first was starting out, though, I kind of had to fight to get to do any of the real animation work. You know, I was kind of shafted into what was called at Disney the ink and paint girls, where that's the only job that they were allowed to do was the inking and painting at Disney. So, you know, I felt a little bit like that I could do that and then show them what else I could do. So I was able to get more of my own independent projects and work on more experimental things, and got better as time went by.
Anybody else? Okay, then we're going to invite you down the hall to the Dyson conference room to take a up-close personal look at the material that Danielle created to animate the film that the others here created. But the rule is no touching, okay? You look with your eyes, not your hands. I'm sorry?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
They're deconstructed, so you're going to see elements.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're really cool.
If you get any good pictures, please share them with us.
Yes.
Yes.
You can tag us on all the social,
that's
you know,
right.
girl with the rivet gun, Danielle.
And thank you all for being here tonight, for braving the weather, coming out.
thank
And
you.
it's just such a delight to see real live people again, not just in a little
Yes.
square.
thank you.
I want to thank our movie makers, our filmmakers, Anne, Kirsten, Danielle, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks for making such a fantastic product.